who are the lead authors on creating this report. And we're joined by Alaa Youssef, a postdoctoral scholar at the Stanford AIMI Center. So before we get into the thick of things, maybe we can just start with some quick introductions, and maybe we can have Daniel, Nestor, and Alaa introduce themselves in that order.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel. I'm the Policy Research Manager at Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence and the manager of AI Index. I stepped down as the manager officially it's April, but before that, I was managing the AI Index reports. And right now, I am leading the development of policy research programs at HI with policy products like policy briefs, white papers with our recent initiatives like the National AI Research Resource and Multilateral AI Research Institute. Very happy to be here.
Welcome, Daniel. Thank you. Maybe Nestor?
Yeah, hi guys, I'm Nestor. I'm a research associate at Stanford High. I was also one of the co-authors of this year's AI Index report. Very excited to be here and to talk about some of the findings. And I also will make a disclaimer that the opinions that I share are not necessarily those that are of my organization or the AI Index. They're just my own thoughts. So just want to kind of get that out at the top, but very excited to be here and talking about what I think are some really important and interesting questions.
Thank you, Nestor. Since these are your opinions, maybe I'll ask you for your most controversial one so we can have a fun and engaging hour.
That's exactly why I made that caveat, just so that we could, get into these hot topics.
Exactly. Plausible deniability for the future. Alaa?
Hi, everyone. I'm Alaa Youssef. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford AIMI Center and also a fellow at the Department of Radiology. My research really focuses on ethics of AI and the clinical evaluation of AI models in clinical workflow. And I'm excited to be here to discuss the hot topics of it. And again, disclaimer, opinions are my own.
Yeah, well, wonderful. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So maybe before we get into any of the specifics of the actual index itself, I was skimming through this when it came out and before this happy hour too. It is a tour de force. There's so much information in there. There's so many insights. How does one go about preparing for something like this? Compared from the academic side of things that I see, it almost reads like a thesis that takes multiple years to develop. But why don't you maybe Nestor and Daniel walk us through what sort of research do you do, what sort of stakeholders do you talk to be able to generate these wonderful insights?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about production process. So our 2022 report is actually our fifth report. We started from 2017 with a very small independent project to 2019, where we become officially integrated into Stanford High. And now we have the 5 years. And 5 years are a very long time in artificial intelligence. The field, come from like 5 years ago, we were still being amazed by AlphaGo and all that, like initial reinforcement learning findings to nowadays we look at powerful large language models and other powerful models. So we work with a wide range of data collaborators from academia, private sector, and nonprofit organizations where we will acquire the data that we're looking for. For example, the AI Index take a multi-sector approach. We look at research development, we look at technical performance, and education, economy, and policy realm. So we'll want to see what data are out there that describe the trend of AI development and progress of the years. And we're lucky to have been collaborating with organizations like LinkedIn, like Google, like Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown, and Microsoft Academic Graph to describe or paint a picture of how far we've come and what's the state we're currently in AI development. And then after we acquire data, we'll do a bit of analysis and on what's the significance of those data presented to us, and finally put that report together. And I'll have to say we couldn't do this without our collaborators, as well as our very amazing AI Index steering committee with a very multi-disciplinary team of members from academia, government policy realm, or from the private sector as well. And for the past 5 years, we're always looking at, every year, we're also looking at what new metrics or what new things we could add that paint a more comprehensive picture of AI development. For example, in 2021, we added the diversity chapter into our report because we think that's a really important topic, and I think it's getting more, and we're glad to see it's getting more and more attention. But we also want to know what's the current state of the diversity of the AI workforce and how that's going. And in this past year, we are lucky to collaborate with Open Philanthropy Foundation to create a whole new chapter on technical AI ethics. In the past, we've done ethics from the social media, the social science perspective, but we've never seen it as what benchmarks are actually out there or how many researchers are working in AI ethics. So through the technical AI ethics realm, we're hoping that this puzzle can be solved. And I think the end result was we're very impressed by the work that our research is doing.
Nestor, any thoughts to add to that?
I mean, I think that's a pretty comprehensive overview. The only thing that I will add in addition is that we do make an effort, even though we work with a lot of data vendors, to really try to do some of our own novel analysis. And I think it's very often in that novel analysis that we can stand out and shine. This year, for instance, we did a robotics survey where we reached out to, I think, 500 robotics professors asking about changes in the pricing of robotic arms that allowed us to really get a novel insight about how that space is changing. Daniel also did a great initiative where he looked at legislative records in different countries so that we could paint a picture of, well, how much do policymakers and legislators actually care about a lot of these issues? And that was stuff that we did ourselves. And I think moving forward, we're hoping to do even more of that in upcoming editions of the index, more novel analysis that can really answer some important AI-related questions that perhaps have yet to be tackled.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I have so many questions already just based on that general introduction of the index. But maybe I'll pick on one point that Daniel mentioned in his summary, which is really trying to focus on something new this year, which was this aspect of diversity in terms of the workforce, in terms of some of the technical AI models. And I'd love to get maybe Alaa's perspective on this, who's really an expert in trying to understand the ethics of a lot of the tools that we're building and some of the ethics of the tools that we want to apply with the healthcare lens. So maybe Alaa, it would be great to get your perspective on what is the state of that field when it comes to medicine, and maybe if there's any shortcomings that we need to address going forward.
Akshay, thanks so much. I think I was really impressed to see this chapter on technical ethics because honestly, I did not expect to see all of that publications in industry towards ethics. And it's really great because it's highlighting an attention and recognition of the biases and systemic issues that exist in society that together as industry and academia, everyone's trying to tackle. So I think the chapter is so rich and it has lots of interesting finding in itself to look for. But I guess the trend towards healthcare right now is I'm seeing the findings going more towards publication. I think the real challenge is how much of these findings and publications are translated in practicality in healthcare, which is the real barrier here. I think we have seen, we're seeing following the hype of AI, we're seeing hype in terms of publications around algorithmic fairness, biases, and all that. But I guess we are yet to see how are we translating these findings and these trends in healthcare to see that we're really improving health equity. We are really decreasing biases and disparities. We are working towards precision medicine. So it will be an interesting thing to see in the future metric. What is the translation of these trends practically in healthcare? I think something I keep watching for is the importance of alignment. So how are industry and academia working together to align the technical infrastructure from model development to policy, working together to kind of like ensure that models are implemented safely. So I kind of like interested to see future on how the industry will collaborate in the healthcare space to help translate some of these.
Yeah, and I think this point of translation is really important. And I'd love to get Daniel's and Nestor's opinion on what that process has looked like for you, especially as we're talking about trying to come up with legislative insights. Especially in healthcare, a lot of things require approval by the FDA before applying them in patients. But could you walk us through what you've learned through these index reports in trying to take some learnings that we know maybe through papers, maybe through informal conversations with researchers, but really trying to create some sort of systemic programs or legislative ideas to make sure that these are broadly translatable? I'd be open to any feedback on that. Maybe we'll start with Nestor. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I can jump in
already.
Yeah, I kind of have a couple of thoughts. So I think to build off of one of the points that was being made, there is absolutely this question of whether the intention to be ethical actually translates into the practice of being ethical. And we do have some data in the index which suggests maybe not completely. We do include information from a McKinsey survey of different business executives. And the survey basically asked them to what degree they consider various AI risks like equity and fairness to be relevant, and whether they're actually taking steps to resolve this issue. And what we find is there is always a bit of a discrepancy between the extent to which they consider an issue to be relevant and whether they're actually tackling it. So more business people would say, for instance, that equity is relevant than actually are going about and tackling it. And I think that, again, is signaling one of the challenges, which is that, of course, it is important to be ethical. And I think there is a big plus to signaling to everybody that you are using AI in an ethical way. But whether you're actually going to be doing that, that's a completely different question. And of course, for a lot of businesses, there can be big incentives to using AI in ethical ways. You don't want to deploy a technology that is going to be used inequitably. That could be bad for your brands, bad for your bottom line. But at the same time, there is evidence that perhaps certain less ethically monitored AI technologies, like bigger language models that are unfiltered, are actually better at doing the tasks they are asked to do. So I think it's an interesting trade-off, and I think certainly one to keep in track of in future years. And that's something that I'm personally very curious about. Are we actually going to see intention turn into action?
Yeah, and just to add on what Nestor and Alaa said at the beginning of the disclaimer, I forgot to add it in the beginning, but all of it say is representative of my own opinion, not of my organization's. When we look at legislature, I just want to add a little bit on that. We are seeing more of a legislative signaling on AI-related affairs instead of, I would say, legislative actions. This past year, one of the biggest thing in the AI policy world is the release of the draft of the EU AI Act that kind of look at the how to really look at the question of how should we properly legislate AI systems. And on a bigger picture, our analysis from the index report of select 25 countries really shows that, when you look at 5 years ago, first of all, the trends was definitely increasing, right? Like there very little legislations on AI like 5 years ago, and there are definitely more now. But another thing that's interesting is 5 years ago, we were looking at legislation focusing on more, how do we invest more in AI? How do we focus more on the development, fostering that very welcoming environment for AI startups? But to nowadays, with the EU AI Act, you're looking more at how do we curb the risks? What kind of actions should we take to manage the ethics aspect of it? And there are several approaches in different, I think, country or region are looking at the field and like taking different approaches. One in the EU is looking at risk category system, right? There high risk system, low risk system. We should completely ban those above high risk system. With high risk system, we should heavily regulate, and with low risk system, it's fine. And when you look at China, which is another AI powerhouse, they released the regulation on recommended system just went into effect this March, and they also proposed legislation on deepfakes. So it seems like that they're doing a more system by system approach. This type of system, like recommended system, is doing this, and the other type, deepfakes or other maybe computer vision related systems, are taking another approach. And in the United States, we haven't seen anything from the federal level. We definitely see city or some states have posed restrictions on the use of facial recognition technologies, and in an attempt to manage those systems risks. But we also look at maybe we'll take a sector by sector approach. Like FDA will manage the AI medical devices. For example, I think it was faculty member, Stanford faculty, Dan Ho and Zhang Zhou and some PhD students like Eric Wu and Kevin Wu and others published a paper, and then we translate into a policy brief just now on a systematic overview of how FDA has been managing the AI medical device evaluation process. So you could see the trend of FDA regulating medical AI devices, FAA regulating the use of AI in airspace. So that might be what's happening. We haven't seen anything on the federal level. The Senator Wyden and Senator Booker's office introduced the Algorithm Accountability Act in early this year. So that might be the start of something. As we see, we're more seeing this legislative signaling on AI, curbing AI risks, but there's a lot more to come.
And when it comes to all these broader legislative approaches, do you see a general trend of these legislative methods being more reactive, or are they more trying to actively try to curb some future risks versus trying to wait for some big events where there might be some negative press and then try to react to that? Do you have any sense on that?
Yeah, I would just say two examples. EU has always been practicing the what they call precautionary principle, right? They want to jump on the things before the risk actually get out of control. We see that through GDPR on privacy, and to a large extent, the EU AI Act is acting on a similar approach. Well, in the United States, it's been 20 years. We've been talking about privacy law, and we still haven't seen anything. It's been years since GDPR has passed. We still haven't seen anything. We more see states start to act at their own, right? California is the first state to pass the Privacy Act, and you see Utah just passed theirs, Virginia contemplating theirs. So it's I think more of a very different approach than the European Union. Actually, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe Alaa, I'd be interested in getting your perspective on what Daniel says and trying to take an even smaller lens when it comes to the FDA. There have been a variety of algorithms that have been approved by the FDA, and based on the latest policy brief and the nice research that came out of Stanford, there's varying levels of rigor required to approve these algorithms. How would you summarize the state of safety and the state of ethics when it comes to some of these FDA-approved methods? Is there more to be done, or are there any particular avenues that you're seeing in the future that could make these algorithms that are approved better?
This is a very nice question, actually. Like looking to date, there are more than 118 algorithms approved by the FDA. I think one of the things and key gaps we are seeing is not that really to assess the level of ethics and level of robustness and safety of these algorithms is to seeing more documentation from these vendors on how their algorithms were developed, trained, and the training annotations. And we're not seeing this as a requirement by the FDA. So, but also to mention that the FDA is doing a really great work in terms of like continuously seeking the community's input on the process of development of the algorithms and the process of their approval, which I think is important because it's important for the developers as well as for the people in academia to contribute their knowledge of how these things should be regulated. I see on a spectrum that you will need to develop, like there will be a need for a role of someone to oversee or ensure the safety of these models. And so a common challenge is updating your models with more training data and submitting that approval. It's definitely a burden to request, like the FDA to be responsible for that. But what we might be seeing more is the validator role, which is like some data curators are able to benchmark the models and continuously publishing some reports and metrics around that. So I think before jumping into whether the algorithms are ethical or not, or like are fair or not, I think the bigger question is we need more transparency in towards how these algorithms were developed. And if people, if the FDA starts requiring, like I think the ACR Data Science Institute has a really AI central catalog, which if you search any of the FDA approved algorithm, it would pull you for you when it was approved, what was the documentation that was submitted. I think it would be better to see more details on the documentation on how these algorithms were trained and developed.
Yeah, and I think this brings me to probably my favorite topic of AI in general, which is the role of data. And I think, as was pointed out earlier in this conversation, we've seen an explosion in the development and potential use of these large language models. I feel like they're really driving a lot of things that are new and exciting going forward. Is that the one place that Daniel, Nestor, you've seen maybe the biggest advance since previous iterations of the report when it comes to new AI technical development? Just these large models where you train a bigger model with more data. That really seems to be the key. Obviously, there's a lot of engineering challenges in making that happen, but I'd be curious if that was maybe the biggest change that you saw this past year.
Well, I think it speaks to a degree with how fast the AI landscape evolves. I think we published in March, and then in April, there were like that 3 sequence of weeks where you had Dolly, then I think you had Palm, and all these big models being released. And I think we touched on them briefly in the report this year, but I would have to warrant that that's going to be something that is going to become a priority for us to analyze in the future, because they are really changing the game, these models. And I think that for me, what the really kind of interesting thing about these models, we kind of hint at this in the report when we talk about, for example, how to get a lot of state-of-the-art results in AI now, you probably need to be training systems with extra training data. And when you look at these large quote unquote foundation models or language models, whatever term you want to call them, what you really need to get them to work is, one, massive amounts of data. And I mean, I think our co-chair, Jack Clark, said at one point, these systems train on percentages of the internet. You need huge computing infrastructure. So again, you can't run one of these models out of a closet in your garage. You need to be running them on soccer fields of computers, and you need money. And again, millions. And I think I read this past weekend an NVIDIA executive saying that we might be into billions of dollars soon with the cost to train these models. And obviously the question becomes, who possesses all 3 of these requirements? And that's large corporations. And I think we really should start to be asking ourselves what it might mean that certain actors, namely private ones, are going to control the way that AI is developing. I mean, it might mean that knowledge creation stays proprietary within a corporate bubble. It might mean that AI develops in a way that favors the incentives of these large corporations. And it might mean as well that you have less experimental developments in AI. I think if you look at historically the way that the US innovation ecosystem has worked, there's this very healthy triad, I think, between the government, between industry, and between academia. And governments historically have sponsored a lot of risky academic projects that didn't seem to be super profitable in the short term, but then in the long term gave us things like CRISPR or the internet. So one of my worries or concerns would be that if AI becomes hyper commercialized, you're going to have a certain set of incentives and priorities that are going to guide the way in which these technologies are developed. And again, this speaks to the preeminence of data in the AI ecosystem. And that's something that I'm keeping my eye on in the near future.
Daniel, any thoughts?
No, I just agree with what Nestor just said. When you look at ImageNet, for example, top 1% accuracy, Google is constantly on the top. And those corporations, like Nestor said, have large repository of image data and maybe other data that for those extra training uses. And when you have, and then you go like general trend that private sector is taking the lead over academia and over government in the general development of AI. And when you have a industry that, where private sector is dominating or is leading, the incentive for research in the area gets shifted quite dramatically to what benefits the industry. And that might have an impact, like things like ethics and other things that we know are important to the industry that has like incentives and counter incentives to focus on.
Yeah, and then with the example of ImageNet, I think this top 1 accuracy or top 5 accuracy that has become popular mostly because that was a benchmark that was established a while ago. And when it comes to some of these large language models, I could have so many potential use cases, either in a zero-shot manner, in a few-shot manner. What do you think is the role of benchmarking some of these models, independent of who owns them, to really understand what is their behavior in day-to-day scenarios? If I were to deploy this broadly, how would they actually react? So how does one go about creating these benchmarks? And maybe who should be creating these benchmarks too? Should it be the model developers themselves, whose incentives may or may not be aligned to have the most fair benchmarks? Or should it be academic groups or the government, who may or may not have the resources even to run inference on some of these large language models, where you can't even have an A100 GPU to load a single model in? How does one try to navigate that scenario? And I think this goes back to one of the points that Alaa had made, that maybe that's one of the shortcomings with some of the FDA-approved algorithms too. We know what some of their indications are, but we don't really know what data sets they've been trained with, what sort of benchmarks of robustness they've passed. So maybe what lessons should we be learning and what should we be looking for going forward? Yeah, I'll go for it, Daniel.
Yeah, I'll make 3 points. First is ImageNet is not perfect. And then, as you said, it was developed years ago. And there have been criticism on the images included are not representative of the population, and which is a very valid concern. And that brings the concern of benchmarks in general, I think, 2 parts. First is we see not only in ImageNet, in the image classification, or also in natural language processing, where you have mostly English dominant benchmark world. We don't see a lot of benchmarks in other languages, and that somewhat kind of prohibit development of natural language models, like natural language processing models in those different languages. The second thing is, I think the question of domain shift is still quite a very important topic to focus on. When you train AI system perfect in the lab world and you have those lab focused benchmarks, they perform well on those benchmarks that was developed here. But then when you get deployed in the real world, you see very bad lighting, you have very bad cameras, and the excellent result in benchmark results might not actually be translated into the real world. The third part is, with the release of GATL by DeepMind this year, you see more systems that are more comprehensive or all-encompassing, that can do multiple things at the same time. So instead of one benchmark at a time, if there are going to be new benchmark, kind of be compatible with those systems that can do a lot of things, or attempt not everything well, obviously, as the paper shows, but testing altogether on the performance. So I don't have solutions as all those discussions go, but there are concerns that benchmark are the legitimate use of testing those AI systems. And I think there's a really great paper by Deb Raji and her team in last year's New York that I recommend everybody look at. And the second question is, how do we improve benchmarks to have it more I think comprehensive and diverse, and can be applied to the real world.
Would you be able to give us a 30-second description of that paper that you described? That's not something I'm familiar with, but I'd love to get a brief overview of that. And then maybe we'll go to Nestor after that to get his perspectives on that question.
Yeah, I think the reason I remember that paper is it's very close to the latest movie I just watched I really love. I think it's AI and Everything in the Worldwide World, if I remember correctly. So it basically just talked about just looking at comprehensive overview of all the most influential benchmarks. And I just point out a lot of issues I talked about, like ImageNet don't have a very diverse set of pictures. And also, I think it's important to bring in this colonialism AI view into this, where AI developed by this particular colonialist mindset might not be the best fit for those emerging countries that are also trying to get into this race, or trying to get into, sorry, I don't like the word race, but get into this world with developing AI, and how should we think about better evaluation system from there?
Yeah, I think those are great points. And I would kind of add two things. On the issue of domain shift, I think you already see this problem to a degree in the field of medicine with medical imaging segmentation. I think there was a very good paper I read in December of 2021 by Syed Kalantari et al. That looked at how well AI medical imaging diagnostic tools performed on chest X-ray pathologies. And they basically found that state-of-the-art systems consistently and selectively underdiagnosed underserved populations, and that the underdiagnosis rate was the highest for intersectional populations, such as Hispanic female patients. And you can imagine kind of the problem this would create if a doctor used an AI system and told someone, well, everything's fine, don't worry about your health, when it turned out that something was actually amiss. And it also speaks to, I think, the incentive structures when we talk about how do we actually combat this problem. And in my opinion, I think there are those that would agree with me. The incentives now in the AI world, and whether this is a result of benchmarking or just the hype that surrounds AI, I think is to build the best and the strongest system. I think as an academic, there's a lot of glory to be had if you top a benchmark. As an industry actor, there's a lot of fame and money to be had if you build a large language model that is just filled with data, some of it potentially toxic, that performs very well. So I think a lot of these actors have incentives to care about performance first and ethics later. It's not that they don't care about ethics, and we do talk a lot about in this year's report how there are ethic benchmarks on the rise, but I would still say, all things being equal, this kind of emphasis on performance exists. And this is kind of outside of the scope of this particular discussions, but I think there's also interesting national security concerns here. I mean, arguably, building more ethical AI systems might potentially mean that they are less efficacious at certain tasks. And I'm citing here literature that shows that if, for example, you filter large language models, so you train them on smaller data sets, they're going to perform less well on language tasks, but be more ethical. Maybe certain countries would want to develop ethical AI systems, but if they know that their geopolitical adversaries are not really going to care about ethics, then it kind of creates this interesting challenge and interesting issues. So I think there's a whole lot of incentives in the AI world that make it hard to prioritize ethics. But for a plethora of reasons beyond just equity, we are going to have to prioritize ethics. I think if these technologies are deployed and people do not trust them because they are unfair, it's going to be a lot harder to reap the benefits of AI. And the benefits, I think, if they're well executed, can be truly transformative.
I really like that you brought up the paper about the underdiagnosis in chest X-rays. I thought there were some really interesting observations, and I'd love to get Ala's perspective on this about what should model developers be thinking about. So let's say if I'm building that model from scratch, is my performance on some intersectional subset of data just a function of the data set? So maybe there might not be that many female Hispanic members represented in my data, or are there more systemic model-based approaches that lead to that performance? How does one go about improving some of these shortcomings, maybe from a data perspective on one end, and maybe from a model perspective from another end? How do you navigate that?
Akshay, this is a great point. I think to add to the point of benchmarking, if possible, I see it as more as a collective duty that, like as data as a public good, that we kind of like work towards building benchmarking models, because this is the evidence based of how we move forward in terms of thinking of models in healthcare. Towards your question, thinking about the ethics of it, I think to Nestor's point, there is no like what could be a bias in one situation could be a needed bias to kind of solve a problem. So I think the one takeaway for any person is a very context specific. You have to look at what is the problem and what is the required mitigation solution here. So for example, we have algorithmic solution for bias as well as we have data solution for bias. We might need to combine both, but we also might need to know that accomplishing for data bias does not mean that the model is going to be fair, or using algorithmic bias was going to make the model fair. So I think it has a lot of test and error. I think we should strive to have representative data as much as possible of the populations we're serving. And I think the thing that as we think of models is, and precision medicine is really to think of the concept of distributive justice, which is that different subgroups have different risks and have different socioeconomic and structural health inequities that are impacting them. How can we use algorithmic bias, or algorithmic bias techniques or data debiasing techniques to kind of adjust that and achieve distributive justice? Like, if we're thinking of the precision medicine, we have to be thinking that we have diversity in population. How are we going to be meeting this? Probably with not one solution fitting all. So can we build models that adapt to the different populations based on the risks and needs? I think that's the core component that we need to think of. Who are we serving? What is the higher purpose? And what type of approaches is going to be effective? Is it just algorithms and data? Do we need to mix both? What type of models can be helpful in that situations?
Yeah, and I feel like that's a really interesting point. And potentially at the end of the day, it might come up to a better evaluation criteria for these models on large enough data sets where we take into account some of these confounding factors that might be at play. Maybe one observation that I see is a lot of time we build these benchmarks after we develop the model. And maybe those benchmarks are conditioned on what your model is good at. So I wonder if there might be a role of maybe the language community coming together and saying, we will create a holistic benchmark independent of models, and we expect a certain level of performance on this. And then it becomes the new ImageNet potentially, but with a lot more benchmarks, a lot more representation from different communities. And potentially this could be done across use cases. The language models was just an example. Maybe there could be other similar cases in healthcare, vision data, you name it. Basically anything that we're developing models for. So I wonder if that could be one perspective going forward.
If I could jump in, I would also say I think there's an interesting issue of institutional shift. The fact that not only might you have this domain shift problem of these systems being trained on one set of data and then being deployed on another, the practitioners of these systems themselves might have completely different standards for what might be appropriate use. You can imagine an AI medical imaging system being developed by computer scientist-oriented individuals and then being deployed by doctors that don't really understand computer science. And perhaps without some regulatory oversight, they're going to have different standards of what constitutes fair use. And there's a plethora of ethical questions that come up here as well. I mean, presuming that some of these medical systems can diagnose certain populations well, but fail to diagnose other populations well, does that justify their use on one set of populations versus the other? Or should we prevent their usage until it is equitable as a whole? And I think different people would have different answers to these questions. But for me, it kind of all ties back to the fact, and I think really this is one of the key takeaways of this year's AI Index report, is that whatever way you slice it, whether you look at private investment data, patent data, the emergence of large language models, AI is here. It is here now, and it is going to get more ubiquitous. And as these technologies become increasingly used by all of us, I think we have a responsibility to really think about how these technologies are used. How do we get the most out of them, and how do we ensure that they're deployed in a fair and equitable way?
Yeah, and now that brings me to one of the other points that I was pretty excited about from this report, was maybe talking about some of the investments that have been made in AI. And I think there's a nice segue to some of the deployment mechanisms that we're talking about. So AI has been popular over the last decade, or more so the last 5-6 years from an investment perspective. Are we starting to see some of those investments pay off? What are some of the big wins from some of the early venture capital or the national government investments? And are any methods being ubiquitously deployed, maybe even beyond healthcare? Maybe I'll pick on Daniel first.
Yeah, we didn't really looking at. Let me go back. One of our main findings in the 2022 report is the amount of private investment in AI doubled from 2020, and I wasn't quite expecting that at the time when I saw the data, but I think the thing that I was expecting is kind of the number of funded companies continue to decrease second year in a row. And the implication of that is you see more and more money going to the top there, and that kind of create a barrier for startups to come in and acquire those, though becoming cheaper, but still expensive compute and data access. So with that, I'm not sure what our topic area would show is that there's more money going to, for example, cybersecurity space and healthcare space, but we haven't seen the general trend of what products are actually being made in AI. But I do want to say that in recent years, you do see this rise of companies focusing on AI safety. There's like, for example, most notable Anthropic, it was created this past year, that are using their resources to create their own system and think about the problems like how to release an AI model effectively, and also what are some of the intrinsic ethical challenges of AI systems.
Those observations that you mentioned where the amount of investments doubled since 2020, but the number of companies that got invested in went down, was that something that was consistent across multiple sectors too? Or were there a couple of sectors that you noticed to be outliers?
I don't believe we did a sector by sector analysis on this. Did we, Nestor? Nestor will be more familiar with data.
I mean, I think I did in my own time. I don't think it made it into the report, but I don't recall there being any kind of notable outliers. I will say, interestingly enough, for this panel, we did do a focus area analysis. So looking at, for example, private investment in medicine versus fintech or legal tech. And private investment in medical and healthcare AI is actually at the top of the list since 2017. So I think it kind of goes to show that a lot of people really understand that these AI systems can really be widely deployed in medicine, whether it is in a kind of patient interface system, whether it is for drug discovery. There are just so many use cases, and investment has really continued to rise since 2017 in this space in a pretty steady way.
And then once some of these models actually get deployed, maybe especially in the context of medicine, how do we actually monitor their safety and monitor their efficacy post-deployment? Alaa, have there been any interesting trends that you've noticed about post-market evaluation of some of these FDA-approved algorithms? Or is there a need to create some of those criteria too?
Actually, this is a really good question, because this is an active area, I think, of research and discussion, is that there is a need for someone in the role of the healthcare to kind of approve the safety and regulation of and efficacy of these models post-performance. And the question becomes whose role it is and what entity can perform this and like benchmark this across sites to demonstrate the safety of these algorithms. And I think it's a backend area where there's a need for more research. I think the research has been very rich in evaluation literature, and I think one of the core components is we also need to think of like what is the system or process of evaluation post-market deployment, and come up with metrics, because if we have metrics, we are able to compare, but the lack of consistent metrics across vendors and across sites makes it really hard for us to know this model is effective in this site, but not effective in this site. So really to make claims about the efficacy of models, its robustness, its reliability, its impact even, we really need to think of metrics. And so far, I think there hasn't been much on thinking of what metrics should we be using to assess performance and monitoring post-market.
And just want to add on real quick. I think the multi-site evaluation, and then I do want to ask Alaa, that like what kind of metrics, for example, for multi-site evaluations do you envision that could be beneficial to the situation? Like, do you send a number of like evaluation site you have to have the medical AI devices tested at, or some of those examples that would be great.
I think if you can set a benchmark of how your model evaluated on the first day when it was first deployed, and have a process of auditing and interpreting how its performance accuracy improved or decreased over time, is it specific to the populations you're serving or not? I think these are metrics that could be reported, because I think different contexts will have different populations. But your metrics could be specific to your site, but they are standard. So for example, if I'm here at Stanford reporting on accuracy and sensitivity of my model on this population, I expect other sites to be able to report that, because that collective information can allow us to do we need to use the data to develop a certain type of metric and evaluation or tools, or is everyone need to have a specific metric to their own side? But the fact that, like we deploy model, the model has had FDA approval, but we really don't know what happened after that. Every healthcare context is almost closed like a bubble. So we lack comparison and benchmarking. And it comes to the point where it's institution collaboration. There's a need for thinking that we are in a healthcare space ecosystem together, and we need to show this, like a lot can be done, I think, with AI analytics and reporting and dashboards and all that. So if we can actually see more innovation on that spectrum, that will really help us gain insight into really how AI is performing in real life, I think.
And I think one of the more interesting challenges specifically within healthcare is it's hard to come up with those metrics too, because, let's say we'll continue with the chest X-ray example. Is the best metric sensitivity or specificity of my imaging findings, or is it important to evaluate how do those findings affect some patient outcomes? Because everything in the healthcare process is a continuum. You come up with one test to determine what to do next. And based on the results of that, you determine what the patient treatment should be. So where in that end-to-end pipeline, in a way, do we want to evaluate our metrics? Do we want to look at final patient outcomes, or do we want to look at the intermediate model outputs? And I think there could be a strong case made for both, which is maybe one of the challenges, that even if we determine that every model needs metrics, having someone agree on which of those metrics are the best use cases, I can imagine varying across multiple use cases, and there being quite a few different opinions about how to use those. But I mean, an interesting challenge going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, it's like you define something, you define a protocol for a study, define how are you monitoring and evaluating. And also one of the key components that I think about is the operational infrastructure of healthcare system is different. So if I think of Stanford, there has a rich IT support system, but another healthcare context might not have that. And so do they need a different type of support? Like you can have an effective AI model, but what is subsequent in the pipeline is not effective. So would that affect the evaluation of the patient outcome down the road? I think like you need to look also not at AI as a piece of the pie, but what is the full pie, or what is the full picture telling me? Because we are like, the goal is for us to see AI making impact at patient care, but is there confounding variables within the pipeline that might affect the evaluation of these models as well?
Yeah, I definitely agreed on that. And I see the clock, we're nearing the end of the hour, so maybe I'll just have a couple of quick wrap-up questions. These ones are for Daniel and Nestor. Was there anything surprising that you found that maybe you weren't expecting, or maybe you had some preconceived notions before analyzing the data, and once you crunch the numbers, you found something that you didn't anticipate being there across the entire report? Maybe I'll start with Nestor. Yeah, switch things up.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I'm trying to kind of skim through the different chapters here. I would say, I guess for me, I perhaps wasn't expecting there to be as much industrial contribution to ethics affiliated conferences as there was. I mean, industry is still disproportionately behind academia, but I perhaps had this assumption that ethics wasn't as significant of an industrial consideration as we ultimately found it out to be. So I think that was something that perhaps I was not really expecting. But again, I think for me, the more pressing question to answer, and we're perhaps probably still 5-10 years away from answering this fully, is to what degree, ethical concerns actually translate into practice.
Yeah, I think that actionable key that we started off with will be useful looking forward in the future. But Daniel?
I think one of the most interesting thing and surprising thing, like half surprising, I would say, is the number of collaborations between the United States and China on AI research publications are still very high. It's always one of my personal research interests to see there's a lot of talking of decoupling between two countries, meaning we have to separate the supply chain, we have to separate research from the get-go, so the development of AI in the United States is not affected by China. But we see that the number of publications, the number of publications by United States and China authors together are still the highest, and almost 7 times more than the second set in that ranking, which is the United Kingdom and China. So it really shows that despite this geopolitical tensions, right? When we talk about OC news, there's still a lot of collaborations happening on the ground. Microsoft has a research center in China, Tencent and Baidu have research centers here in Silicon Valley. The scientists still want to work together. And I think that's a good news for AI development.
Were you able to stratify some of those results to see if those collaborations are more on the industry side of things, or are they more on the academic side of things?
We will love to do a more detailed analysis on that. Yeah. It's something to come.
Yeah. Well, I guess that maybe brings me to my final question. Maybe just quick thoughts on maybe some things that you'd like to investigate in the future based on some of the findings. Obviously, there's a lot of data that you guys have uncovered, and really there's so many interesting questions that one could potentially ask. What are you looking forward to next year if you had time to work on this report? Maybe we'll start with Nestor, Daniel. Maybe I'll get Alaa's perspective too. What would you like seeing, maybe from a healthcare perspective, in a report like this going forward?
I would love to see information on popular opinion regarding AI. And I mean, you could ask questions that are healthcare related, such as, would you trust the use of AI in diagnostics? But I think I would be more broadly interested to see what attitudes people had on the front of AI. Is AI one of these things that people are excited about? Is it one of these things that they're a bit terrified of? I think there's also a lot of these interesting questions that concern the topic of AI sentience. I mean, I don't know if we're ever going to have a public opinion survey on that, but some Google engineers think that AI is sentient. A lot of other people do not. But I think there's a lot of interesting questions that ought to be asked about what it means to be human. Are we comfortable using AI if it is better than humans at something? Like, if AI objectively can drive cars better than humans, would we be okay with AI car fatalities? I don't think we really have a clear sense at the moment on a geographically comparative level of how these different attitudes stack up. And that's something I would be super curious in.
Yeah, if I were in that survey, I would check mark that I'm both excited and terrified simultaneously. But Daniel.
3 things. One is public investment. That's something that I wanted to do before I even started the job, but I still haven't been able to accomplish because it's such a complex problem, especially how much money each country promised to put in AI are actually getting appropriate on the ground. The second is I would like to see more development in auditing realm, especially very efficient auditing, especially like in the very critical area of healthcare. You see research. I think AIMI was part of this research with other universities on AI model may be able to detect race without physician even knowing. And in that sense, auditing become increasingly important because post-market analysis is not going to help when those AI systems go rogue. The third part is, and I would say, how did would the future research on AI malpractice? So when you have an AI malpractice problem, who should be blamed, and what does the current US legal system say?
All very big open questions. Alaa, maybe final word for the session.
I think I will look for more onto public perspective of what AI is. I think we lack understanding of what patients and public in general think AI beyond media looks like in healthcare and what that applications look like. I would like to look more about the diversity in AI education. According to the report, there has been an increased number, like never before, 5-fold increase in CS graduates. But also one of the things is that still gender gap exists and still low diversity in terms of education. So I look forward to see diversity metric on AI education. And I look forward to see how AI will be applied in global health contexts, because these are countries with huge health disparities and inequities beyond healthcare, and AI really has a true opportunity there. And fourth and final is governance and equity and accountability and ethics. I look forward to see how, not beyond legislations, but how organizations are going to develop governance mechanism that ensure that they're accountable to public and accountable to the safety of the patients and the clinicians that work in these organizations.
Yeah, and I think so many links with what Nestor and Daniel said at a public level, at a private level, at a national level too. So some very broad questions that we as a community should be thinking about. But on that note, it's almost 4 o'clock here. I'd like to say thank you again very much for Daniel, Nestor, and Alaa for joining, and for Daniel and Nestor for all the hard work on putting together the AI Index. It's a fascinating read. I'm still trying to make my way through it, but we're looking forward to more iterations of this. And thank you all 3 panelists for taking the time and having this conversation. And thanks everyone on YouTube for joining in live.